Hi, Stella from Meeple University here. If playing board games excites you, then you've come to the right place. If you want to teach board game like a pro, or you're good at it and just curious on what this video is about, then that too. This video is for you. Basically, this video is for everyone. One of our channel's main focus is to make how to play videos to teach board games to you, so you can play the games quickly with learning in mind, less entertainment. If you want to be entertained, you can try juggling, or go to stand-up comedy shows, or choose our parody videos like this one's here. I am very biased, but I think Tarrant is one of the best at teaching board games. If you feel like some of Tarrant's videos have helped you in the past for learning board games, please let him know in the comments. Like and share this video to mine as well while you're at it. It'll make our hearts warm and fuzzy. Anyway, this is what the video is about. So here's how to teach board games like a pro with Guru Tarrant.
Well, I don't know if I'm a guru, but I can definitely help you with some tips when explaining board games. I'll take you through 5 general tips for what can help you to explain board games. It's important to know that each game is unique. Every game's different to each other. Some have different quirks and foibles that make them easier or harder to explain, but what I'll try to do is give you a general structure which should help you out. The first tip is to prepare and know your audience. You really can't give a good explanation of a board game if you haven't prepared for it in some way. That's true in all cases. You can't teach in person, you can't teach on a video, and you shouldn't even try to teach a game that you've just picked up from a library at a convention if you haven't done some level of preparation. If you have picked something up from a board game library and just want to play it at a convention, I still believe it should be one person reads the book and learns it and then teaches, rather than everyone trying to simply work from the rulebook. And there's a good reason for that, and it's that when it comes down to it, rulebooks, especially for heavier games, are not generally written in teaching order, and they're not really supposed to be. I've often seen comments and things from people who complain about a certain rulebook being really hard to understand, and the reality is that for a rulebook, it has to be written mostly in a reference style. You need to get all the information about a certain element of the game out in one place. And that's not often the best way to teach it. Often you'll put things in a rulebook that are in an order that makes them easy to reference, that matches like the layout of the components. Recent game Civolution is a good example of that. There's 20, 30 different actions in that game, and the best order in which to learn them is not the order they're laid out on the board. And so you can't expect the rulebook to teach them in the order that they are easiest to learn from, because you need to be able to ready reference that section when you're playing. It doesn't mean a rulebook's not a useful reference to help you when you teach and help you jog your memory or get specifics out. It's just that going verbatim and reading it in the order it's written is rarely going to be the best thing for you. And I think over the whole time I've been learning heavier games, there's probably only one game where the rulebook is written in the exact order that I would teach it, and that's Great Western Trail. And that's not a comment on whether its rules are better or worse, it just happens to be that is laid out in that way. So what do you need to know for your preparation? The first one is to know the audience, know who you're playing with. And that may sound like a simple thing, but it's important for understanding what level of detail you need to go into. And a good example is a game like Clank. When you play Clank, the way you teach that is going to vary depending on your audience, because there are some people you can play Clank with and you just say, this is deck building, it's identical to Dominion, and on you go. Or you may be playing Clank with people who are just new into the hobby, and then you need to teach how deck building works properly as well. And that's as true for an in-person teach as an online teach. If you've seen our videos over the journey, when I'm teaching or when I'm doing a how to play for a heavy game where deck building is an inbuilt component, like a Great Western Trail or an Endless Winter, I pretty much just say, this is deck building, and on you go. Whereas if I were doing Clank, I probably would explain deck building from first principles, because I see it as a gateway or gateway plus game, and I would expect that a big part of the audience would need to learn it from scratch. You need to know what people are trying to get out of the game you're about to play. And that's the biggest question there, is whether you are doing a rolling teach, getting people the information they need to get started and then teach as you go along, or if people want to have all of the information in front of them from the very first play to try to have a complete and fair game in the first game. And that very much varies by group. Many people expect to go into the first game as a throwaway so that the second game is going to be perfect. Many people aren't going to see some of these games that often and want to have as good an experience the first time around. Certainly the groups I play with, and my standard way of teaching in person, is to get all of the information on the table. People want to have the complete experience the first time around. Online, different content creators have different styles. Certainly our style with the how to play videos is to get all of the information out there. And we do have a couple of summary formats as well, our newer quick start tutorials, which will get you going in a rolling teach kind of way. Meanwhile, for game designers and game demoers, there's really a third type of teach, which is the demo teach, the convention demo, where you almost script the first few turns, or you set the game up in such a way that demonstrating 3 or 4 turns is going to give a flavour for the game. And it's an entirely different type of teach again. And I've always found that an interesting challenge in its own way, figuring out, the best cards to stack on top of the deck, which rules to ignore, how many extra resources to just randomly give people at the start of the game, because it allows you to get every piece of the game out. When I talk about preparation, it doesn't mean knowing word for word how you're going to teach a game. I know back in the day when I first started teaching heavier games, I used to read the rules, take notes, and then read from those notes, and that would give me the structure of how I was going to go about it. As I've taught more and more games, I tend to do a lot of that thinking in my head, but certainly I will have read the rules and spent some time trying to figure out what is the best order to get the information to the people who are learning. Because really the last thing you want to do is just to be throwing out bits of information from random elements of the game in whatever order they come to your mind. That is not going to help the people who are playing. So that's a few different things to think about, but really it's the first major point is some sort of preparation really helps to give you a good teach. The second point I'm going to cover in this video is the general sequence, and this is probably the most hands-on tip I can give. This is what is the most effective way to structure your teach. What order are you going to teach things in, which makes the most sense for people? And elements of this will be very game specific and audience specific, but I would always start with context setting of the most important things. And that really covers what is the setting and the goal of the game from a thematic standpoint. So it always helps to know thematically what you're doing. Even if you're playing with heavy Euro games who don't really care about the theme, it helps to say, even if it's something as basic as, here we are in Barcelona and we're building up Barcelona. It always helps to point out the mechanisms, so as long as you know your audience is going to recognize them, you can very easily say, this is deck building, you'll be doing worker placement here, and that will immediately put people into the frame of mind of knowing roughly how their mind has to be set for the game and the teach. You always want to give people the win condition. So people like to know the win condition because as they're learning the game, they want to see the things which are going to move them towards that win condition. It helps them to understand what's important. So if it's as simple as whoever gets the most victory points will win, and that's obvious when there's a victory point track around the board. But it can be as simple as, all right, get most victory points, and victory points come from these sorts of things. I would almost always do this. If the win condition is extremely complicated or confusing, like, for example, Oath, I would possibly even skip this at this point and say, I will explain the win condition later, but almost always you'll want to explain the win condition. And likewise, you'll want to give a clue to when the game ends. And I would used to say explain when the game ends, but sometimes a lot of games these days will have complicated end game triggers. Like I wouldn't explain the gallerist's combination of end game triggers necessarily, but if it's a 3-round game, you say it's a 3-round game. If you say the game ends when this deck runs out, do that. It helps people to get a sense for how long or short the game's going to be. So those 4 points, the theme, the key mechanics, the victory condition, and how long the game runs, those kind of form the introduction of a teach. For me, the next objective is to get as quickly as possible to explaining what you do on your turn. And this is probably the most singularly important part of the teach, because you'll get to this stage where you'll explain in a clear chronological order when it's your turn to start thinking and making decisions. What is the process I'm going to go through? So that's kind of that anchors the early part of any teach. But it's very rarely the next thing you get to after the introduction. Between the introduction and the turn sequence, you need to point out key components and bits of context in the game at its most basic level, basically getting out whatever information is needed to understand the turn sequence. And this is what forms everything around the structure of a teach, is that you want people to know what they need to know before going into detail on anything. So in most online video teachers and in a lot of our how to plays, this is where people will talk about setup. And setup kind of helps you because it allows you to see the components and where they're laid out and understand what the names of components are. So even if you're not using the setup portion of a video explanation to follow along and set up your game, that section of the video is still helping you out because it's telling you what things are called, it's showing you your player board and giving you a general idea of the sorts of pieces you've got. In my videos, particularly in heavy games, I'll often skip over the step-by-step part of setup because I actually don't think going step-by-step through setup when there's 20 or 30 setup steps is particularly useful. But I will always set the game up and point out the components because for me that gives you the same level of context that you would have got out of a setup part of the video, as well as allowing me to do it more quickly. And certainly if you're doing a teach in person, you're not going to be going through the steps of setup because it's probably already set up on the table. But you will point at components and say what they're called. So that is a key part of that context setting and the benefit of explaining setup on a video. So in this section, this context setting section, you point out the main board. You say, this is the map. You're going to be putting stuff on there. This is your player board. You're going to be taking pieces off there. You don't need to explain what those pieces are or how it happens. You just need people to know what things are. And then depending on the game, sometimes there are other bits of context that are important before you get to turn sequence. And for me, and this is an important part of preparation, the key thing to consider is if you're going to explain any mechanism or set of rules in detail before you get to the turn sequence, there has to be a really good reason to do that. It has to be important to understand that mechanism before you can understand the turn sequence. Otherwise, you're getting things out of order. I'd say this is always something that Stella and I have disagreed on a little bit. She's always very keen on getting to the turn sequence as early as possible. I'm a little more liberal with that and with some of the context setting if I can see it's going to add value. But definitely we both agree that you want to get to the turn sequence as quickly as possible and never interrupt it with other stuff. You always want to go through the turn sequence in its best summary level. So a few examples of games where I have gone into other mechanics in detail before getting to the turn sequence. They're often ones particularly that relate to explaining how you spend things and how you manage your resources. That's probably the most common because often you can explain how that works in a self-contained way and you need to understand how to spend things to understand the turn sequence. So Black Forest is a good recent example. Black Forest uses the glass road type of resource management mechanism. And there's a few things in there, and you can explain it in a very self-contained way. But it's very helpful to know that before you get to explaining your turn sequence, because on your turn sequence, you're almost always having to spend some of those resources. And so being able to explain how that works at that highest level really helps. Another example is a game where one of the resources is gained in a different way to the others. Something like Star Trek Captain's Chair, Manhattan Project Energy Empire. Most of the resources, you just take them and spend them from a supply, but there's one where there's a fixed supply on the board and you have to take it from there and spend it elsewhere. Very simple to explain that ahead of time so people know that the resources they're looking at are different. Meanwhile, a game like Brass has these underlying mechanisms around how coal and iron move around the board, which you need to understand all of the actions. But you don't really need to understand it to know the core turn sequence of playing a card and then choosing an action from it. And that was something that was early on. We made a video for Brass probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember it was a big tension point when we were working out how to do that video, that I wanted to explain this bit of context before getting into the turn sequence, and Stella disagreed. And in the end, she was right. It didn't support the turn sequence part of the explanation in the same way that some of these others would. So really, through all that advice and all of those examples, the core thing to take out of it is that the best structure to go into, or the best standard structure to go into, is to do an introduction with theme, basic mechanisms, goal of the game, and how long it will take. Then go into any context and component setting that you need to do. Then go into the turn and round sequence in high-level summary without interrupting it. At that point, it's really up to you. That's where games really diverge, and what order you go in will really depend on the game. And it's pretty common to go through, at this point, round phases in order, and then pick up all of the different action options, and then mop up all of the types of things that didn't fit anywhere else, or little free actions that pop up from time to time. And then finish off by summarizing the scoring and summarizing how to win. Which brings us on to point 3. How do you take all of the detailed information that the game has and explain it in the best order? And for me, the general approach is explain the easiest stuff first and work up to the complex stuff. Because the easiest stuff is going to be self-contained. You'll be able to explain it without knowing any of the other things. You want to minimize circularity. You want to minimize the extent to which you have to say, I'll come back to that later. And you want to maximize the extent to which, when you introduce a new concept and go into it in detail, that all of the background information is known. So if you're playing, a simple example, if you're playing a game where there's one action that lets you draw a card, one action that lets you build a card, and then one action that lets you use that building now that it's built, that's the order to teach them in. Don't explain how to use the building first and then how to draw it, because it's not going to flow logically in people's minds. And that may seem like obvious advice, but again, you're not always going to get the help from rulebooks, because they may have things in the order they're laid out on a page. Rulebooks will often cover the easiest action last, because it's kind of that all-purpose action that you do if you've got nothing better to do. There's just various reasons why it may not be laid out on the components in that way. Never feel like you have to go through the actions in the order they're printed on a card. So let's look at a simple example in a game like Ark Nova. You know that if you're going to play an animal card, that you need to have that card in your hand, and, well, at least at the start of the game, but have that card in your hand and have an enclosure on your board for it. And you may need to have prerequisite icons to play that animal. So obviously you're going to teach cards and build before you teach animals. And then animals is a circular action, because it's the tags on the animals that are going to give you the tags for other animals. So you frame your examples that way. You teach cards, you teach build, then you teach animals using an example where there are no prerequisites. Then you say, hey, now you've got these icons and these are tags. Tags can help you meet prerequisites for animals like this one. Here's one I prepared earlier, and so on. Again, this example might seem very obvious, but particularly in a complex teach, it's going to be full of lots of little decisions like this, and they're all going to overlap with each other. And so the extent to which you can get them in the most logical order is going to help your explanation the most. And it's never going to be perfect, and sometimes you'll have forgotten a small thing and you'll have to jump back and explain that even though it's irrelevant to where you are. Doing that a few times is not too bad as long as you get to a natural stopping point to do it. But if you're constantly jumping back and forward between actions, it's going to confuse the students. And then I always find that as you're going through details, it always helps to bring it back to scoring and winning. If you are demonstrating an action which leads to scoring, point that out. People like to see signposting of scoring over and over again. You roughly explain the types of things that will contribute to scoring at the start of the game. You point them all out as you go along. You summarize them all at the end. Because getting to the end of a teach and suddenly learning about the 5 or 6 things that hadn't even been mentioned that are worth points, now you've got to reframe your mind. Again, people are trying to figure out what's going to be important to them as they're learning a teach progressively. And if you get to the end and suddenly 3 or 4 things that you thought were secondary to the game are now actually very important because you've just learned they're worth points, that is going to cause confusion. And so I'll go on to the 4th point now, which is some tips for handling complex circularity and strange orders. So I alluded before to the animals card in Ark Nova and how it kind of describes itself. Circularity is very common in board game rules, and it's what can make rulebooks so hard to understand. Again, the rulebooks are explaining an entire concept in one place using things you haven't learned about yet. It's why you often have to read a rulebook twice to understand it. But you don't want to be doing that while teaching. You want to try to find a way to break the circle and explain it in a sensible way. And the key is to find the weakest link in that circular set of actions. Find the single easiest entry point, the half action, like the second half of an action, that is the easiest to understand and take for read in a standalone way. So an example would be if you've got this whole set of circular actions that rely on each other, but say one of them is this complex way of constructing a building, and when you put the building on this shared board, it no longer owned by you, but you get a bunch of points based on all these placements, and then where the placements are impact your ability to take other actions. That's a pretty good entry point, because with most people playing a game as heavy as that just sounds, you'll be able to say, there is an action, or throughout the game, we will be taking actions to construct shared tiles on this board. I will explain how we do that later. All you need to know for now is that these tiles get there and nobody owns them. And then the rest of the actions hang off where they are. That will be enough for most people. They'll know that they can shelve the idea of how the buildings get there and come back to it later and just focus on what the buildings do. So that is the key way to get around circularity and have an efficient teach. Find the easiest thing that a gamer can take for granted. And then the second tip when you've got circularity is once you've completed the circle, completed the chain, stop and summarize it again. Just go through each of the actions in the correct circular order so that one flows to the other, so that everyone can fully contextualize that link. The other tricky thing to watch for is that some games will introduce new rules in subsequent rounds. Like the rules of the game will change as you go along. And the simplest example to think of for this is a social deduction game where players who have been killed or eliminated actually haven't been killed or eliminated. They're now in a different state and they contribute to the game in a different way. Whenever you've got a game where that is the case, without exception, I've found you can explain everything that is available at the start of the game first and explain the new actions that are coming later. And it almost always works because by the inherent way the game is designed, you can't have an action that only appears in round 2 that all the other actions hang off, because then round one just wouldn't work as a game. So you can basically always do that in chronological order. Sometimes if all of the early actions really support the second action in a heavy way, you can go back and re-summarize how they all link together, go back and explain the context on round one's actions. But really, you can always explain those chronologically. Which brings us to tip 5, and tip 5 is really, I'm just calling it greatest hits and lowlights. These are some examples that have worked really well for me in the past in tricky games, tricks I've used to get around things that were quite hard to explain. And sometimes I just ignore all of the other rules that I've explained here if it really supports the game. Comes back to the start, every game is unique, and some of them really demand being taught in a completely separate way. The first tip I give is that there are many games out there, even really crunchy spreadsheety Euro types of games, where you can still really use the theme to your advantage. You don't always need theme to support a teach, but there are some games where it can really help. And a couple of our really popular how to play videos where that comes to mind are Hadrian's Wall and Spirit Island. If you think of Hadrian's Wall, when you start that game, you're presented with 2 pages of pen and paper roll and write types of boxes, and they're just everywhere. There's like hundreds of boxes. It is hard to pass all of that information. And the theme really helped me in that game because I was able to recognize and separate and step away from the mechanism and just say, up here you are defending the wall. You're going to be taking actions which defend the wall. Down here, you're scoring your victory points. Over here is society. It doesn't support the wall, but it's all these other ways of getting points. So as long as you're dealing with the wall, then you can build up all these tracks and score points separately. Taking that approach, I think, really helped a lot of people to understand what was a very information overload game. Another game where I've really used theme to help the explanation is Spirit Island. And Spirit Island is actually a surprisingly difficult game to explain because the turn sequence is completely jumbled up compared with the sequence you would use in your mind to understand the theme. It's almost the complete reverse. It's really jumbled up. And part of it is that when you go through the turn sequence, you are doing some actions, and then the settlers are ravaging, then building, then settling. But thematically, they're settling, then building, then ravaging. So getting that into your mind if you're going through it in a turn sequence way, because remember I said turn sequence is the most important thing to do. To understand turn sequence in Spirit Island, you really need to understand the full thematic overview of the game. So in our video for that, I spent about 4 or 5 minutes, I think, explaining the island and how there's already the Dahan there and how there's spirits and they have this non-corporeal influence, and then the settlers come and the settlers spread out and they build and then they ravage, and this is what it does to the spirits. So that whole 4 or 5 minutes of that video, and it was very unusual for our how to play videos, there was almost no mechanism described. There was a little bit of what components look like and how they spread, but essentially the whole thing was thematic before going into the turn sequence with all of that context. Evacuation was another game where that approach really helped. Understanding old world resources and new world resources and transport between the two. You can't go into the mechanisms of that game without really getting a thematic understanding of what it all means. Then, even if you're not thinking about the theme, there's often really different ways to go about teaching games. Oath was always a really interesting one for me. It was a very tough video to film in our style because it was a game with so many different and intricately woven win conditions. And on top of that, the rulebook was written in a rolling teach, demo teach kind of way. Oath did not have, and it's something that that Leader Games has done with its rulebooks. It's always had a rolling teach type of rulebook and then its legal document type of rulebook. And neither of those is that conducive to my style of teach, being the full teach, to get everything on the table at once. I remember with that game, it all fell into the context setting. I was able to introduce the sorts of things you needed to do to win in a very summary way. So it's like, you need to control this piece, or you need to have that relic. These 4 or 5 things, they're not necessarily going to make you win, but they could make you win if other stuff happens at the same time. So getting that context out, at least people could see one of the things I'd point out and say, ooh, I might need to control this. I'll prick my ears up when the rules are explaining how to do that. Then at the very end, after all the other rules were on the table, that was when I came back and explained the Oath Keeper and the in this scenario with this you win, in this scenario with this you don't, and get through all of that in detail. And I think in the end it really worked well as a full teach, but it was one of the tougher full teaches that I've done on how to play. Similar sort of thing with Frostpunk. When we did a how to play video for Frostpunk, it was quite a different one because I almost did the least context setting I would ever have done for a game of that complexity. It kind of was because the turn sequence was well enough laid out that I was able to explain things as I came along, but it was quite an unusual teach. One of the things I do remember about that from a win condition standpoint is trying to be as summary as possible. And it was similar to Oath. I had to be very vague about the win and lose conditions and then come into them in detail. And I remember what I said in that was, the game is scenario driven, the cards will unfold the story, and you'll win if you find something that says you are victorious. You lose if you max out any track with a red skull. There's a few examples like coldness and overwhelming death. Basically, if it sounds bad, it will probably make you lose the game. And this brings me to my final point, which is that unless your preparation involves actually solo playing through a game, you could do all the preparation you want and still end up recognizing halfway during your first play that you're hitting the wrong emphasis, or that you haven't given something the credit or importance it needs. You'll find that something is actually more important than it looked in the rulebook. And you feel bad because you recognize that quite quickly, but all the other people at the table are sort of learning it slowly. Or maybe you all learn it at the same time. Some examples of games where that's happened on my first play. I remember Expeditions. That game, so much of the rules were about moving your mechs around the board between the hexes and doing the actions on the hexes. Got halfway through the game before realizing that getting a good tableau and a good little deck going was actually the way of getting the most points in that game. And it was a real surprise. It just changed the whole way of thinking halfway through the game. On a lesser scale, Mistwind was a recent example. We played this game and got halfway through and realized that the port bonus was really undersold by the name port bonus. It's actually a very strong action and quite an important thing to go and chase after. And so we'd got to this point where we'd finished the first round and suddenly a few people had these really valuable actions that no one had quite realized were as valuable. So, as I say, unless you have solo played through a game before you've taught it, there's really no way other than experience to intuit and work this out. And it's why your first play of any game, as much as you try, is always going to have an element of throwaway, and your second game is always going to be better.
Well, now that the secrets are out, about teaching board games that is, not our very rare couple bickering, you should be ready to teach board games. You got this! Imagine yourself doing a teach like a pro. Or maybe you'll do a tutorial video like Tarrant. Ooh, how fun! However you want to use these valuable tips, hope this video has been useful. And please let us know if it is. If you have questions, suggestions, give it a like and subscribe. And good luck, board game teachers!